Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see so many people here. Offer you a warm welcome to AHSS Presents, a conversation with Ian Burrows. My name is Rula Dimitriou, and I'm a lecturer and programme leader for the MA Drama Therapy within this faculty. We're extremely excited to have Ian Burrows with us today to talk about some of the ways in which traumatic material is treated as coercively comic on stage, in the lecture theatre and in the media. He will look back at his own teaching using the literary material from that teaching to think through the media coverage that attends the use of trigger warnings. There will then be a Q&A where you can question or reflect on the ethics and power dynamics involved in presenting traumatic experience on stage and in the classroom. It's important to point out that today's session is being recorded, but rest assured that if your camera is off, you won't feature in recording. If you would like to ask a question in the Q&A, and we welcome you to do so, that means that you will appear in the recording. And just to say that if you do have questions, you can use the chat function to write your questions there and they'll be picked up. So Ian, over to you.
Hello, and thanks, Rula, and thanks everyone for having me. Thanks for joining me this evening. So to begin with, I suppose this whole project began with some lectures which I gave for the third year tragedy paper at Cambridge. They were called The Limits of Slapstick, and I put some warnings, some small symbols to warn the students that we would be covering material involving sexual assault, and importantly, I think, covering it in a particular kind of way, which I hope to touch on today. That decision to put a small warning triangle next to the title of my lecture series in our Notes on Courses catalogue attracted some media coverage. And so I then wrote a response to that, which gives you a bit of the backstory. So if I get too boring in the course of this talk, I've just put a link to that article in the chat. If you want to multitask or find out where this is coming from, then do check that out. But otherwise, let me crack on and let me begin with a PowerPoint. Okay, so we will get to the trigger warnings by and by, but to begin with, I wanted to just give you a little preamble. This is the foreword to Gavin Williamson's white paper on free speech and academic freedom. And he says at one point in this foreword, when I was younger, there was widespread consensus that the UK had done the right thing by offering Salman Rushdie sanctuary after he became the subject of a fatwa for publishing the Satanic Verses. It was a mark of our free and liberal society. The attempts to ban Lady Chatterley's Lover or Monty Python's Life of Brian were similarly seen as an embarrassment that was thankfully in the past. Though people might disagree and protest, there was no right not to be offended. That consensus, he says, is now being challenged. There are some in our society who prioritise emotional safety over free speech, or who equate speech with violence. This, he says, is both misguided and dangerous. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt makes the case powerfully. Not only do such attitudes suppress speech, they make it harder to draw a clear line against violence. So these are words apparently written by Gavin Williamson, the first ever person to become Education Secretary by winning a raffle. I don't necessarily want to get into the rights and mostly wrongs of this white paper's policies. If possible, if it's not too indulgent a thing to do today, I'd just like to begin by looking at some of the literary strategies being used in this foreword. Because we all know, don't we, that kids nowadays are oversensitive, that things were better in the good old days. And we're invited here to imagine a bright-eyed Gavin in short trousers, just Williamson, if you will, queuing up to attend a screening of Life of Brian. We all like Life of Brian. Salman Rushdie in his one pocket, D.H. Lawrence in the other. None of these things did him any harm, he says. Curiously, he doesn't mention the efforts to suppress the publication and circulation of Nabokov's Lolita in the late 1950s, a novel, of course, with a paedophilic protagonist. He doesn't mention either James Kirkup's The Love That Dares to Speak Its Name, a 1976 poem which seems to describe a Roman centurion having sex with the corpse of Christ, banned from publication in 76, and still, so far as I'm aware, banned now. These examples, I suppose, complicate his point. But for Williamson, this is more than stupid, oversensitive kids avoiding things they don't like. Note that strange warning tone. There are some in our society, moving in the shadows perhaps, their views misguided and dangerous. Let me come back to powerfully. Williamson's is only a foreword. It's unfair perhaps to expect a coherent philosophy being set out here, but it's notable even in this extract that a consensus is good when he approves of it, as when he was younger, but on the other hand, as he puts it earlier in the foreword, today's orthodoxy can become tomorrow's oppression. So heterodox ideas are good, except on yet the other hand, these ones about emotional safety and so on, which are misguided and dangerous. In my opinion, Williamson could stand to include an "in my opinion" here, but he prefers at this point to address his opinions as fact, and indeed says he is backed up by an authority, not just any authority, but a social psychologist. What is social psychology? How does it work? Who cares? It sounds sciencey, it sounds logical, not like one of those newfangled wishy-washy things like straightforward sociology, which all the snowflake kids are taking nowadays, like media studies, or English for that matter. And the social psychologist in question, Jonathan Haidt, doesn't just make the case that Williamson approves of, he makes it, William says, with power, powerfully. He's not actually quoted Haidt, but I'm sure we can trust Gavin Williamson to have read his work and not to have summed it up reductively. If you can't trust Gavin Williamson, who can you trust? So I begin with this preamble for two reasons. First, because today I want to look at these propositions apparently endorsed by the woke elements among us. And I want to use literary analysis to think about them as phrases and to think about what's going on when this overall state of affairs is being performed by somebody, as Gavin Williamson is performing here. How does one equate speech with violence? I could say several things to or about Gavin Williamson that might very well hurt his feelings, but is that alone what we are talking about when we think of the ways in which language might injure someone or cause them harm? To say the case studies that follow involve people being offended would seem to diminish and trivialize their suffering. For even though the earliest usages of the verb offend carry stronger connotations of physical violence than they tend to nowadays, so it seems to derive from the Middle French offendre, to strike against. In general use now, we reach more readily for offend, it's more intangible, abstract definitions: to sin against, to violate or transgress, to hurt or wound the feelings or susceptibilities of. So it's kind of migrated in the way we use the word offend now, away from physical harm to something more nebulous. But this relationship between physical existence, physical harm, and the more nebulous feelings of transgression is a key point of fascination in the works that I want to touch on this evening. In the case studies that follow, I hope to show that the situation constructed in Williamson's foreword is a kind of drama, and that many writers have constructed comparable dramas in which language is used not just to injure, but to create power dynamics, to coerce and to alienate figures within that drama, using a kind of authorial power to frame them and to move them with or without their agreement. And crucially, in such dramas, language doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates with reference to the sometimes concurring, sometimes resisting flesh and blood of the performer. And eventually, this discussion will touch obliquely on my own teaching. The lecture theatre is itself a kind of theatre, even if we don't routinely sell small pots of expensive ice cream in the interval. And just as a dramatist exerts and exploits their power over their performers and the spectators, so too does a lecturer set out a particular position with regards to the independent volition of the lecture's attendees. How important is it today when I remind you now that you can all leave at any point? What is the nature of and utility of that communication? And is it really something so dangerous? Okay, let's turn to a bit of Shakespeare. Over and over again in his career, Shakespeare presents us with characters trying unsuccessfully to physically disappear. Think of Richard II saying as he stands before his usurper, "Oh, that I were a mockery king of snow, standing before the son of Bolingbroke to melt myself away in water drops." Or Hamlet in a funk saying either, depending which version of the play you're consulting, "Oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt," or "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt." One of the most extended sequences like this is found in Antony and Cleopatra. When thinking Cleopatra dead, Antony compares himself to several images, or rather the succession of those several images. A cloud that's dragonish, something like a bear or lion, a towered citadel, a pendant rock, a forked mountain, and so on, before concluding, "Here I am Antony, yet cannot hold this visible shape." In all these instances, it seems to me that the transformative effects of poetic description are rather ludicrously undermined by the stubborn presence of the actor's body. Antony, in particular, can hold his visible shape. In fact, he's stuck in it, something emphasized by Shakespeare, having Antony then clumsily and unsuccessfully attempt suicide in the moments that follow, and then having the actor's body lugged about the stage for hundreds of lines more before they're allowed to play dead in Cleopatra's arms. In cases like this, in examples like these, the speaker talks in such terms to describe their sadness, but their pitiable state is underscored by the very practical manner in which they are entrapped in their bodies in this place in front of us. In Antony's case, he does not just describe himself dissolving. He tries to delete himself, he tries to commit suicide, and he falls clumsily on the floor. This extended regard of this strange body demands of us all onlookers a rather bewildering test of empathy. This is how Alex Clayton puts the question when he talks about bodies in Hollywood slapstick films. "How do I know," he says, "that the body of another is not entirely unlike my own, say rubbery and numb, rather than fleshy and sensitive?" The seed of doubt raised by such questions is a matter repeatedly circled around and played upon in physical comedy. While we might commonly associate slapstick tropes with comedy, what these examples in Shakespeare seem most often to suggest is that the presentation of the body as being made of potentially alien material doesn't necessarily, or doesn't a priori, conduce to laughter. Indeed, very often you'll find that this mode of presenting the body is often aligned with a character's particularly traumatic circumstances. Probably Shakespeare's most emphatic demonstration of this is to be found in Titus Andronicus, when Lavinia is raped, her tongue cut out, her hands cut off, and then she's required to remain on stage performing a succession of ridiculous actions, carrying a severed hand in her mouth, struggling to write with a stick, chasing her terrified nephew across the stage. What I've provided here in the bottom corner is an image taken from Lucy Bailey's 2014 production of the play at the Globe, which, as you can see from the headlines alongside it, caused a lot of attendees to faint in the course of its performance. And while that image, I think, helps highlight the aspect of content stressed by the headlines, the gore of it all, I think it also highlights a more troubling aspect of what the play does. Propped up here like a puppet or a dummy, the production shows a particular form of powerlessness, which intersects with the quality of being entrapped within the body. And that entrapment, I find, in Titus is used by Shakespeare to announce his own coercive power. Lavinia is made to behave as he and others in the play demand. And so that question of Clayton's is circled around, not just in conventional comedies, it's circled around in circumstances that are in fact more conventionally considered tragic, or at least troubling. And it's a distinction between the rubbery, numb, alien bodies and bodies like ours, fleshy and sensitive, that is, that's applied not just to the physical figures observed within plays, but to the descriptions of figures who watch and study those plays as well. So in the headlines of these stories, just the fact that audience members faint soon turns them into slapstick, inscrutable, alien, rubbery, numb bodies as well. So that happens not just in terms of characters, but in terms of how we describe people in proximity to the plays we're talking about. So this takes us to one prominent and quite influential example, which was written up eventually into a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. You can see the cotton wool on the cover there. This book started out originally as an article published in the Atlantic in 2015, and it has the same title, The Coddling of the American Mind. That article, the book as well, form an extended argument against what the writers Lukianoff and that man Jonathan Haidt call a movement among university staff and students which is affecting to scrub campuses clean of words, ideas and subjects that might cause discomfort or give offence. For Lukianoff and Haidt, attending to possible microaggressions, thinking about and providing trigger warnings leads to an overall culture of what they term vindictive protectiveness. They believe that within this culture, students are encouraged to develop extra thin skin in the years just before they leave the cocoon of adult protection and enter the workforce. We all become butterflies when we enter the workforce. Though the article was careful not to use the term snowflake, by arguing that the movement that they were describing, quote, presumes an extraordinary fragility of the collegiate psyche, they lent a touch of scholarly polish to some of the attitudes seen in many comment thread discussions of snowflakery. And that brand of scholarly polish has proven very successful. That subsequent book, The Coddling of the American Mind, was named one of the best books of 2018 by the New York Times, the Financial Times, the New Statesman, Bloomberg, and the London Evening Standard. So the culture that Lukianoff and Haidt make out and name vindictive protectiveness, what's elsewhere termed snowflake culture, is founded on two elements. First, in the view set out by Lukianoff and Haidt, the subjective experience of the individual, how that person feels, has been given undue weight in everyday campus discourse and behaviour, and unhelpful privileging of, quote, emotional reasoning, they argue. Second, they believe that university students and staff are too much engaged in anticipating how other people might feel. They posit that trigger warnings, concerns about microaggressions, arise from the mistaken belief that exposure to the hateful thing, quote, could traumatize some other people. You believe that you know how others will react and that their reaction could be devastating, end quote. Though these imagined students may be thought of as having feelings, indeed as having too much feeling, Lukianoff and Haidt managed to stage their empathic processes in a way that renders them automatic, figures so ruled by feeling, so tuned to anticipating the feelings of others, that their actions are ridiculous and arbitrary. In their way, slapstick figures, rather than figures moved by independent, logical volition. When the grieving Hamlet concedes that it's common to lose a loved one, his mother Gertrude asks, if it be, why seems it so particular with thee? And though it was Hamlet's uncle and now stepfather Claudius who murdered Hamlet's father, he doesn't let that stop him issuing a rough and ready pull yourself together, saying, 'tis sweet and commendable in your nature, Hamlet, to give these mourning duties to your father. That father lost his, and he goes on to persever in obstinate condolement like this, is consistent with, quote, unmanly grief, a heart unfortified, and a mind impatient, and understanding simple and unschooled. As if to underline the message that 'tis common to experience the grief that Hamlet experiences, Shakespeare plants other unfathered sons throughout the play. See, for example, the Norwegian Prince Fortinbras, named like Hamlet after his father, or Laertes, who loses his father Polonius to Hamlet's sword. And indeed, Hamlet actively participates in a society himself, which insists roughly and rudely that grief should look a particular way. For example, at one point he pits his grief against that of Laertes, who's mourning his sister Ophelia. 40,000 brothers, Hamlet says, could not with all their quantity of love make up my sum. And thou, mouth, he says, I'll rant as well as thou. While Hamlet and Laertes jostle with one another to see who grieves Ophelia's death the most, we see two figures trying to outperform each other in what they are apparently feeling. But over the centuries, readers have tended to sympathize with Hamlet, allowing him his uniqueness, rather than agreeing with his skeptical on-stage onlookers, Gertrude and Claudius. Think just how often you may have seen Hamlet quoted telling his mother, "'Tis not alone my inky cloak denotes me truly, I have that within, which passes show." That mode of feeling is allowed, if grudgingly, if somewhat skeptically, by Lukianoff and Haidt in their arguments. For a student who truly suffers from PTSD, they say, appropriate treatment is necessary. And that still doesn't settle the problem of how an onlooker is to be convinced that the scrutinized figure is behaving according to that within which passes show. Google the fairly hackneyed journalistic phrase withdrew into himself or withdrew into herself, and you'll find stories of mothers grieving for lost sons, of victims of molestation and sexual assault, of people confronted with life-changing medical diagnoses or subjected to chronic pain conditions. As familiar as we may be with that model of withdrawing into oneself, the practical problem remains for the spectator. How do we spot the trauma if it isn't physically apparent? Spooling forward a few hundred years, in Lucky, a memoir written by Alice Sebold detailing her sexual assault and the years that followed it, Sebold remembers her walk home immediately after being assaulted. "I was aware," she says, "I was being stared at. They talked, but I wasn't there. I heard them outside of me, but like a stroke victim, I was locked inside my body." Despite the literary and cultural conventions by which we allow a victim of trauma to have that within which passes show, to occupy a position inside their own bodies, accounts and presentations of such trauma also often show an external gaze working in counterpoint. Sebold herself recounts how, learning of a classmate's own sexual assault some months later, she remarked to a friend that, unlike her, quote, "she'll wear the rape eternally," a little like Hamlet's inky cloak. In such formulations as these, trauma is described as being worn by the victim and seen from the outside. Such instances might just rest as writers acknowledging the difficulties encountered in trying to know what someone else is going through when they've been traumatized. But very often these difficulties appear to lead to an onlooker doubting or even denying outright the individuality of a trauma victim's experience of the world. Lukianoff and Haidt express their firm opinion that efforts to second-guess that person's experience are taken too far and too often by too many people. Grossly expanded conceptions of trauma, they say, are now used to justify the overprotection of children of all ages, even college students, who are sometimes said to need safe spaces and trigger warnings lest words and ideas put them in danger. Their skepticism is ostensibly directed at the onlooker's response, talking of grossly expanded conceptions of trauma and overprotection seems not to argue against the possibility of trauma existing, but argues instead that we too often mistake someone's non-traumatic discomfort for the kind of trauma which Lukianoff and Haidt would consider authentic. But like Gertrude telling her son to cast his knighted colour off, Lukianoff and Haidt emphasize that their viewpoint is removed from the victim and that the victim is to be considered from the outside. Even when they concede that, quote, "for a student who truly suffers from PTSD, appropriate treatment is necessary," their truly betrays their mistrust. How can we know that the traumatized behaviors we witness in another person correspond to an authentic experience of trauma? In their book, they turn often to another book, The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And they observe at one point that its definition of trauma has morphed over the years and become, they say, grossly expanded. And they stumble on a problem inherent to communicating and understanding trauma. The criteria, they say, for a traumatic event that warrants a diagnosis of PTSD were and are strict. To qualify, an event would have to, and they quote the DSM, would have to evoke significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone and be, quote, outside the range of usual human experience. The DSM-3, which was published in 1980, emphasized that the event was not based on a subjective standard. They emphasized that. It had to be something that would cause most people to have a severe reaction. They then go on to complain that by the early 2000s, the subjective experience of harm became definitional in assessing trauma. But we can see here that some 2 decades earlier, the DSM-3 was already struggling to talk around the kind of subjective experience that determines a traumatic event to be traumatic. How, in short, do we identify an event that would likely, quote, evoke significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone if that event is, quote, outside the range of usual human experience? The novelist Siri Hustvedt homes in on this central problem in her memoir, The Shaking Woman, or the subtitle, A History of My Nerves. In it, she tells us how when she began shaking uncontrollably while delivering a talk at St. Olaf's College, Minnesota, in honor of her dead father, it appeared to onlookers, quote, that some unknown force had suddenly taken over Hustvedt's body and administered, quote, a good sustained jolting. In the years that followed, Hustvedt tried to identify the cause for this pathological shaking, consulting specialists in a range of different medical fields, traveling, quote, in the worlds of neurology, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis, as she puts it, which leads her to no obvious conclusion, nor after years of multiple treatments and diagnoses is she able to conclude whether her pathology has arisen due to circumstances in her neurological state or her psychological being. And this leads her to reflect how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is purely descriptive. The DSM does not tell stories, she says. It contains no cases of actual patients or even fictional ones. Etiology, the study of the cause of illness, isn't part of the volume. Its mission is purely descriptive, to collect symptoms under headings that will help a physician diagnose patients. The fact is that all patients have stories, and those stories are necessarily part of the meaning of their illnesses. In Hamlet's everyday world, it would seem that he feels very few of the people around him allow him his own singular story. He is, we are told at one point, the observed of all observers, over and over again, looked at, questioned, and talked about. This explains in part, perhaps, his rather plaintive request to Horatio as he lies dying, tell my story. Yet even if Hamlet notes correctly that most in the court do not allow him the singularity of his grief, that father lost his, why seems it so particular with thee, the playwright at least does afford him a great deal of singularity in the way he's presented. Hamlet speaks more lines by far than any other character, more than any other character in a single play across Shakespeare's entire canon, in fact. And a great many of those lines are spoken uninterrupted as monologues and soliloquies. And although Gertrude may ask him to cast off his black clothes in the first scene in which he appears, the very fact that he's dressed like this acts to distinguish him by stark visual means from all other figures on the stage. Even if the precise motivations of the character Hamlet may prove recurrently and naggingly inscrutable to the audience, by these measures, by many others, the play Hamlet does try to tell his story over and above anyone else's. But other Shakespeare plays come closer to modelling people as Lukianoff and Haidt do in their writings on vindictive protectiveness. For all that the Comedy of Errors showcases many traits that enable us to accept it easily enough as the RSC does, quote, a farcical comedy of twins and mistaken identity, Shakespeare embeds occasional suggestions that experiencing one's identity as interchangeable is profoundly stressful. Thought to be mad based on his twins' behavior around the town, Antipholus of Ephesus is subjected to the ministrations of a certain Dr. Pinch. They brought one Pinch, he says, a hungry, lean-faced villain, a mere anatomy, a mountebank, a threadbare juggler, sharp-looking wretch, a living dead man. This pernicious slave, forsooth, took on him as a conjurer, and gazing in mine eyes, feeling my pulse, and with no face as 'twere outfacing me, cries out I was possessed. The therapy administered by Pinch and his attendants is disturbing in itself. Antipholus is bound and borne to, quote, a dark and dankish vault, and he's left there until he says, quote, gnawing with my teeth my bonds in sunder, he escapes. But more disturbing still, I think, the image of Antipholus being outfaced by a figure with no face signals the culmination of his losing a sense of unique individual identity. In the course of the play, Antipholus of Ephesus has been rendered itinerant from the visual signifiers normally used to identify him, to the extent that he now describes a situation where he's mirrored by a void. So that's not to say that I think The Comedy of Errors is a play about trauma, but if it is a comedy, possibly because it's the kind of comedy that it is, I think it does explore the processes of alienation and of dissociation encountered by a number of characters who have happened to survive a traumatic event. It's not obviously funny when Antipholus of Syracuse says the following about searching for his twin brother, who he lost in a shipwreck, for example. I to the world am like a drop of water that in the ocean seeks another drop, who falling there to find his fellow forth, unseen, inquisitive, confounds himself. And this isn't an isolated point of anxiety. The Comedy of Errors is animated throughout by an ongoing concern that characters are losing control of what makes them, long before Dr. Pinch is brought into the stage to outface Antipholus of Ephesus with a void. We think of Shakespeare as the poet of all time, but when you read through The Comedy of Errors, the word mad recurs over and over again, almost compulsively. And it really stands out almost as a lack of vocabulary. Everyone in the play is obsessed with the idea of maybe being mad. So the Comedy of Errors may be capturing something more of what it feels like to be dissociated, to be entrapped in a body and not fully in control of oneself. This is something that's articulated in a tale that's much less obviously comic, the memoir that I've already mentioned, Alice Sebold's Lucky, published in 1999. And she begins that memoir with an account of her sexual assault in 1981, charting the months and years that followed, her post-traumatic experiences, her being questioned, the apprehension and trial of her rapist, Gregory Madison. Reading that book, it's remarkable how often she was physically scrutinized in the months following her rape. Accordingly, her memoir draws attention to instances in which narratives were constructed and laid upon her based on her physical appearance. This culminates in her account of the trial. I was frightened and shaking when I crossed the courtroom, past the defense table, the judge at the podium, the prosecution table, and came to take the stand. I like to think I was Madison's worst nightmare, although he didn't know it yet. I represented an 18-year-old virgin co-ed. I was dressed in red, white, and blue. Only some hours after the assault, she is required by the police to be photographed. Later in the days after the rape, she notices, quote, an elegant latticework of bruises on her body, and she makes out, as she puts it, the individual pressure points of his fingertips on my throat, a butterfly of the rapist's two thumbs interlocking in the center, and his fingers fluttering out and around my neck. Sebold's lack of alienation from her own body is, of course, lack of control over her own body is, of course, earlier very literally and violently enacted in the act of her assault. The rapist's words, she says, led to her, quote, lobbing off each part of my body as he claimed ownership, the mouth, the tongue, the breasts. In the course of the memoir's narrative, Madison is arrested and successfully prosecuted. Various people around Sebold attempt to put a positive spin on narrative progression. One court bailiff later described her as, quote, the best rape witness ever seen on the stand in New York State. But it's worth wondering what exactly is meant by that, what exactly he is celebrating. And recalling and writing these experiences, Sebald gestures to the sense in which she was often dissociated from herself, displaced again from her own control by being regarded from an external viewpoint. At the trial, she says, my mother had always taught us to be scrupulous when wearing a skirt by smoothing it out before sitting down. I did this, and as I did, I thought of what lay beneath the skirt and slip, still visible if I lifted up the hem through the flesh-toned stockings. That morning while I dressed, I had written a note to myself on my skin. You will die was inked into my legs in dark blue ballpoint, and I didn't mean me. Consider here the slip in phrasing between I had written a note to myself and the address to Madison, you will die, I didn't mean me. The strain on the language highlights the uncomfortable way in which Sebald sought to act of her own volition, while nevertheless occupying another person's gaze rather than her own. This kind of forced dissociation is perhaps most acutely exemplified when she recalls the moment in Madison's trial when she was shown the photographs which had been taken of her by the police in the hours immediately after the rape. I'm showing you the photographs marked for identification 13, 14, 15, 16. Look at those, please. He handed me the photos. I looked only briefly at them. Are you familiar with the person depicted in those photographs? Yes, I am, I said. I placed them on the edge of the stand away from me. Who is that? Me, I interrupted him. I began to cry. By trying not to, I made it worse. Years after Lucky was published, Sebald told The Independent how encountering the photos again while researching the memoir had affected her. She said, it was intense to see the palpable absence of myself in the photos straight afterwards, that I had already taken on an intense level of shame. Similar, perhaps, to the moment in the Comedy of Errors when Dr. Pinch, with no face as 'twere outfacing Antipholus and Theseus, Sebald is forcibly estranged from herself, a mirror image which doesn't show her herself, but rather a palpable absence. The option then to include a small symbol next to the title of my tragedy lectures in 2017, it seemed to me was a useful one. In many respects, I found that it was the opposite of any kind of censorship, that it actively increased the chances of students who needed it being able to prepare themselves and being able to participate fully in those lectures. And I found that those warnings put the students who didn't need them to absolutely no inconvenience at all. But it was more than something helpful, I think. It was something actually very productive. Reading back over an invitation from the faculty administrator, I was told that I might consider including such a symbol in cases where, quote, teaching contains material that could be considered upsetting, such as accounts of violence, abuse, etc., and it is not immediately obvious to the reader that this could be the case. And that phrase, it is not immediately obvious, made me think of the ways in which trauma and post-traumatic states are not obvious. And as I studied the texts I most wanted to discuss, which I've been able to discuss again tonight, the writers showed me that alienation, disconnection, dissociation are not obvious things. But these writers also alerted me to the power dynamics that govern the staging of post-traumatic existence and the descriptive powers which we all have, whether we're playwrights or teachers or journalists, commentators, all people in general, the power we all have, I think, to put a traumatized person in that place, to render them figures who are alien, disconnected, and dissociative. The content of the recent Globe Romeo and Juliet may not be all that challenging. A frequent theme in comments under coverage like this is that we all know what's in Romeo and Juliet. We all know that suicide happens at the end. So the content might not need a warning, but the form of that play and the form of this performance in particular may well have been confronting. And the commentary arising from the coverage of that warning certainly was. If Yorkie 101 was indeed taking the male's invitation to regard the traumatized people who watch the play as not of the real world, not of our real world, that is, not bodies like yours and mine, then ironically, the term he used here, pathetic, undermined that sentiment somewhat. Its etymological root meaning, it seems, not just being susceptible to feeling, but capable of feeling. And it is a basic and simple courtesy, it seems to me, not to deny someone their capability of feeling. Thank you. Thanks.
So, thank you, Ian. Is there anything else to add? Was that?
No, I'm
okay.
all done.
Great, thank you for that very interesting and thought-provoking talk and perspective from your own experience, and talking about the reaction to that, about trigger warnings. So we are going to have a question and answer session. So if any of the audience has any questions for Ian, if you can put them in the chat, and then I will can read them out and Ian can answer them. But to start off, to give you a chance to do that, rather than offering a question, I would like to offer a response with a list of words, and maybe that will kind of produce a question as well in the audience. But listening to your talk, the words agency came up, responsibility, power, voice, anger, fear, blame, othering, discomfort, and scapegoating. I'm sure that there are many others, but those really stand out. So it's really interesting to see the reaction, and perhaps you can say a little bit more about the kind of impact of that reaction to the trigger warnings on your work and on your students, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that anger is really interesting. And I found when I scrolled through lots and lots of comments online, that anger did circle around this idea of an attempt to define and then police the real world. And when I'm I would say, when I'm really stretching to feel sympathetic to some of those unsympathetic comments, I do think it probably comes from a place of fear, that we would rather not allow the fact that students, actually quite a large number of students, have been sexually assaulted, that talking about that and talking to people who have been sexually assaulted is difficult and is scary, I think. So the impulse to say that people who have been, for example, sexually assaulted, that didn't happen in the real world, and that the real world is somewhere where that doesn't happen. Universities are full of something more abstract, wiggly, notional, theoretical, I think is an attempt to sort of defend oneself from an obligation to think about these things, to have hard conversations potentially, but also to have hard thoughts and actually think that people are sexually assaulted in the real world, and that people maybe are affected and upset by your actions and the way you talk about things as well. So that when I want to think the best of people who are impatient with those kinds of warnings, it is because I think it's a fear of upsetting someone potentially. That's where I've ended up with that, I think.
Great, thank you. We've got a question that's been put into the chat, It's a question from Roland Weimer. I wonder if you'd like to unmute yourself, Roland, and ask the question yourself rather than me reading it out.
Yes, okay. In your talk, and very interesting book, which I read just before the talk, you talk a lot about the whole things revolves around the responsibility of the lecturer, and your sense of the difficulty of dealing with this kind of material. But in a way, that's secondary to the question of the responsibility of the artist, isn't it? I mean, the artist is going to sort of plunge into all sorts of difficult stuff, violence, sexuality, blasphemy, etc. So there are quite big questions about what we want from the artist and what we want from art, which almost predate the question of us secondary people who are sort of mediating this art to other people. Do you have any sort of things to say about that?
Thanks, really. That's yeah. It's you've lasered in on the most difficult question I found when I was writing the book. But it's something I hesitated about, and actually when I wrote the Guardian article, which I linked to, one of the things that I said was, I haven't changed my lecture in any way. I haven't censored it. I've just put a warning on it, and that enables people to participate in it more fully. And the thing that I didn't put in the article, because I'm a charlatan, was actually it did change the lecture because it didn't surprise people so much. When I first wrote the lecture, and I didn't begin with a paragraph saying I'm going to talk about custard pies and then I'm going to be talking about assault. When I first did it, the move I thought was surprising, and that sort of made me feel clever and unexpected and original. And then the more I thought about that, and actually as I write about in the book, a student leaves the lecture, I then kind of felt sick and thought, oh my, why on earth did I think that smartness, that surprise was useful in any way? And so removing that suddenness, really kind of signposting that I was going to make a move pedagogically, that I had no need to surprise anyone. So at length, what I'm saying is, yes, I agree with you that an artist might well want to say, no, it's my right to surprise people. It's my right to take people somewhere unpleasant. The only thing that I found probably since finishing writing the book is the kinds of art that are made, and the difference between, say, a playwright like Sarah Kane and a playwright like Shakespeare, that when Shakespeare is confronting us with a spectacle that's hard to understand, he does, I think, more than Kane, surround that spectacle with people saying, what the hell is going on here? So Rula and I earlier were talking about the end of Lear, and having onlookers saying, is this the promised end, or image of that horror? And it's something that I write about in the book as well. They don't feel that important in the scene. They feel even a bit histrionic. Just a couple of people saying, oh my God, how awful, what's going on? But I'm increasingly thinking that actually maybe those coordinates for us are very important, that we can sort of imagine that, we have a proxy confused person on stage to say, I am also confused and upset. And I wonder whether that's one of the reasons that Sarah Kane elicits such angry reactions from people. The people who ostensibly are saying, God, I hate Sarah Kane, it's rubbish, all I do is laugh at it, what a waste of time. They are very upset by her plays. And I think it's that confusion is not given an outlet. There's no one to hold your hand and say, yes, it is confusing, you are disoriented, but that's okay. So ethically, I still don't know. Like, if there is an artist who wants to discombobulate their audience, should they be allowed to do that? I'm still hedging my bets on that. In general, it feels more productive when they're given a way to articulate what's happened to them, I think.
I mean, there's a famous quote from Kafka, a book should be like an axe to smash the frozen sea within us, and I actually am extremely drawn to that kind of notion of art, actually. And I've taught most of the plays you've taught, and I actually think their extremeness is quite important in a way. But in a sense, you issuing a few trigger warnings is almost like it's a storm in a teacup, isn't it? It's, I mean, why not? You know, it's not a big problem. The problem would be if you actually decide we can't teach this material, we can't actually discuss this material. But issuing warnings is sort of a very minor thing, really.
Yes, no, I completely agree. And actually, I think for me, my thinking around warnings changed significantly when there were first reports about there being warnings. You know, the more extreme reports were saying Cambridge now puts trigger warnings on Shakespeare, you know, in general. And so I asked any students who come to the lectures if they wanted to come and talk to me about a possible response. And a lot of students who spoke to me about it, who had gone through, say, traumatic things in the past, all of them said that the warnings have been useful to help them participate in the discussion, to actually participate in the lecture. And I had always thought, until that point, a warning is just there to tell people, if you don't like the sound of this, don't come. And it's possible, you know, to be fair, my sample size was of people who came. I don't know whether lots of people stayed away because of the warnings, but I was struck by the fact that the warnings, not just, you know, I agree, are not really, they are a storm in a teacup, but also they were actively productive, I think, for some students. I think the extremity of some pieces of art, it's very interesting that some of the people who were most scathing about trigger warnings were also arguing, A.N. Wilson said that King Lear teaches us to endure. And that was his opinion column in the Mail. And I think actually there is something that is productive, potentially, about seeing awful things on stage. I mean, that, you know, whether we think of it as catharsis or whether we find that misery loves company or something like that. Before the talk, I was talking to Rula about her work in drama therapy. Like that, you know, there clearly is something very productive about the form for people thinking through atrocity, thinking through their own pain. But I suppose, yeah, it's up to the individual dramatist whether they want to put someone in a very confusing place without emotional coordinates, without help getting back into the foyer to talk about the play that they've just seen, or whether you are just going to leave them in that dark place. I guess that's different playwrights will have different takes on it.
And we've got another question, and it might be our last question, just looking at the time. So a question from Vanessa Cornford, who says, thank you, there's a lot to think about, and is asking, what other topics or themes of lectures do you think should contain warnings?
That's another brilliant question, which is my way of saying another question which I'll probably give an evasive answer to, I'm afraid. It's something when I talk to people and colleagues about this question of warnings, quite a common response to say, well, so where does it stop? How do you anticipate everything that might hurt potentially someone in the lecture theatre or in the seminar room? And I think that's where I felt most confident thinking about it with these lectures was that it wasn't really to do with content. It was to do with form. It was to do with that power dynamic of treating someone else's trauma as a comic thing. And again, the advice that I was given that I could use warnings where it wasn't immediately obvious that they might be that, you know, troubling material might be covered. That again, it struck me as it was a formal thing rather than content, really. It was to do with the surprise that might otherwise result. And actually that was then what generated the lectures. So really the idea of trigger warnings came first, and then I began to think about, you know, surprise trauma in some ways, and began to think about comic traumatized bodies from there. So I don't really know the answer. I think thinking about them is in itself a really productive thing to do. That in my experience so far, I've not encountered anyone who I have been teaching who has said, I think you should have put a warning on something and you didn't, and I'm now very angry or upset. And that's not, I don't think, because I have correctly anticipated everything at all. But I think it has been valuable as a little reminder to myself when teaching to try and think of the things that I might be taking for granted, or or thinking of as being unproblematic. So yeah, a completely evasive answer again. But I think for me content warning has in some ways been quite an unsatisfactory cue for thinking about this. Trigger warning, I know lots of people think is also maybe not right as a term, but it is to do, I think, with the form of the discussion sometimes, where that warning, whether it's formal as a little symbol, or whether it's just kind of practicing good communication and not just kind of blurting out something, that's where I've found it most useful and helpful to think about.
We've got one more question about the term snowflake. So I'm wondering, I'll say the question, and hopefully there's time to give a good answer. So the asking about the expression snowflake, you seem to imply that it is itself a violent term through passages about melting bodies and drops of water, etc., which are connected to the subjective experience of trauma or self-alienation. Using such a word for a whole group of young people, suggesting that they think they would all melt together, is uniquely degrading. No?
Mm-hmm. I think that's really well put. It's partly when I was talking about this. So the chapter in the book where I think I most thought about the term snowflakes was in a chapter called "No Two Alike," and that was because when I was thinking about this idea of snowflakes and why it's offensive, I was thinking, and in general, in the same way that if people call me woke, I'm not particularly offended by that. I'm sort of more troubled by where that is coming from. The idea of snowflakes, at first I thought, so why is that a problem? And thought, well, it's because it's stereotyping, it's generalizing, all those things are not nice things to do to people. But I think the angle that I was coming at it from in the book was also that there is something quite coercive about recognizing that someone is upset and then saying that you are choosing to ignore it or you are denying the authenticity of it. So snowflake, it's an interesting assertion, I think, over someone, often more than maybe calling someone pathetic or what the insults I've seen recently, flannels, wet wipes, generally sort of limp things, all troubling terms. And again, they don't come from a nice place. But snowflake is, I find, interesting because it is both identifying someone's desire to be individual, and it's identifying that they are hurt, and then it's refusing them sympathy. So I think it's a really interesting term, I think.
Great. Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time. So I would like to thank Ian Burrows for that very thought-provoking talk and perspective. To thank all of you who have attended this evening, and to thank, sorry, noises outside, and to thank those of you who have asked a question. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.